Bridgeport, Connecticut, summer of 2005. The small third-floor apartment trembled gently whenever a city bus rumbled down the street outside. Nettie Nance's belly was round and full. In just a few weeks, she would give birth to her first child. That afternoon, she decided to clean out the wooden dresser drawer beside her bed, looking for the documents she needed to complete her health insurance paperwork. The room's window opened onto a shared courtyard between the buildings. Children's laughter floated up from below, mixing with the faint strains of R&B drifting from a neighbor's old radio. A desk fan clattered softly as it pushed warm summer air through her hair. The smell of lunch from the apartment downstairs mingled with the musty scent of the wooden drawer. A familiar yet stifling atmosphere. Between stacks of old utility bills and yellowing warranty slips, her fingers found a sheet of paper, fragile and creased at the corners. At the top, in bold print, it read, "Certificate of Live Birth." She exhaled in relief. For years, every attempt to enroll in school or apply for a job had been blocked by her lack of an original birth certificate. This thin piece of paper could finally open the door that had always been closed to her. But when her eyes dropped to the fields labeled "Name of Mother" and "Name of Father," her breath slowed. The names printed there were completely unfamiliar. Not Anne Petway, the woman she had believed was her mother for all of her 18 years. Not any father's name she had ever heard mentioned in her life. The date of birth matched the one she had celebrated every year. But the parental names belonged to another world. She turned the paper over, searching for a footnote, a clerical error, something to explain it. Nothing. The lower edge of the page bore the unmistakable red seal of the City of New York's Vital Records Office, official, valid, beyond dispute. Memories began to weigh on her. As a child, whenever she asked for her birth certificate, Anne would say, "It's lost," or "You don't need it." Nettie had never pressed further. Anne had been the one to raise her, to feed her, to show her love. That had been enough to quiet any lingering questions. But now, the paper in her hand cracked that silence wide open. She remembered standing at school registration desks, watching the clerks' puzzled faces when she explained she didn't have a birth certificate. She remembered being turned away from part-time jobs because of missing documents. Once, she even lost a scholarship opportunity for the same reason. Back then, it had been a frustrating inconvenience. Today, it felt like a warning, a sign that her life story might not be what she thought. She recalled the evenings when Anne came home late and brushed off her questions with a wave of her hand. "Don't worry about it." That same deflection now echoed in her mind, sharper than ever. Did Anne know more than she had ever admitted? Nettie sat on the edge of her bed, eyes fixed on the paper. In her belly, the baby shifted. A quiet reminder that time wasn't standing still. She needed health insurance. She needed valid documents. But above all, she needed to know who she really was. In that stillness, her mind began sketching out the next steps. She could confront Anne directly, but the answer might be another evasion. She could go to the New York Vital Records Office for a certified copy of her file, or try searching online. No matter the path, she understood that once she started, nothing in her life might ever be the same again. The question echoed in her head, as clear as if she'd spoken it aloud. If this is my birth certificate, then why do my parents' names not match? At that moment, Nettie was 18, soon to be 19. She had never suspected anything unusual about her life beyond her lack of paperwork. But on that quiet afternoon in 2005, in a cramped Bridgeport apartment, another truth began to surface. One that would pull her back to the summer of 1987, to a secret buried for nearly 2 decades. She rose and walked to the window. Outside, the late afternoon sun lit the cracked red bricks of the building opposite, every fissure deepened by years of weather. A distant car horn bled into the whisper of wind slipping through the frame. Nettie gripped the birth certificate tighter, feeling both heat and chill in her palms. Beneath the ink and seal was something far larger than a bureaucratic form. It was a story, and she knew she would have to follow it, detail by detail, until she found the truth. That afternoon in 2005, as Nettie stood by the window gripping the birth certificate, she couldn't shake the feeling that the life she had been living, the life she thought she knew, might have been built on a carefully crafted illusion. And yet, until that moment, her world in Bridgeport, Connecticut, had felt steady, familiar, even safe. She had spent nearly her entire life in Bridgeport. Its worn sidewalks, corner stores, and modest row houses were as much a part of her as her own name. She lived in a small apartment with Ann Petway, the woman she believed was her biological mother. For as long as she could remember, it had been just the two of them. Ann provided for her in the way any parent would: clothes for school, food on the table, advice about friends, and warnings about life's dangers. Sometimes Ann's tone was firm, even sharp, but her authority was rooted in years of being Nettie's only parental figure. Still, there was one constant oddity in Nettie's life, an absence she had grown used to but never entirely understood. She had no official birth certificate, no social security number, no official proof that she existed in the eyes of the U.S. government. As a child, this felt like a small inconvenience. But as she got older, it became an invisible barrier she couldn't get past. Friends applied for part-time jobs, opened bank accounts, and got driver's licenses. Nettie tried too, only to be told she was missing the required documents. Every time she turned to Ann for help, the explanations were vague and inconsistent. Sometimes Ann claimed the documents had been lost in a fire or misplaced during a move. Other times, she told Nettie she had been abandoned by her real parents, that she had been given away as a baby, and that certain paperwork had simply never been done. The story changed in its details over the years, but it always ended the same way. There were no papers to give her, no real answers to fill in the gaps. As a teenager, Nettie longed for independence. She wanted to earn her own money, buy her own things, and feel the same sense of adulthood her peers were beginning to taste. But each time she tried to take a step forward, she was reminded that she lacked the basic identification everyone else took for granted. Bridgeport could be a hard place to grow up. The city bore the signs of economic struggle: closed storefronts, cracked roads, neighborhoods where opportunity felt distant. Yet Nettie made a place for herself. She was known as friendly, easy to talk to, and dependable. She had hopes for the future, not always well-defined, but real, rooted in the belief that she could create a better life for herself and her eventual family. Ann's protectiveness was both a comfort and a limitation. When Nettie wanted to travel with friends or join school trips requiring formal ID, Ann often found reasons to say no. Sometimes it was about money, sometimes safety. But over time, Nettie began to suspect these excuses were covering up the truth. She didn't have the documents needed to go. The subject of her origins surfaced only occasionally, usually when Nettie's frustration boiled over. "Why don't I have a birth certificate? Where's my social security card?" she would ask. Ann's responses were a mix of dismissal and emotional deflection. "It's not important. You have me, and that's enough," she would say. Other times, she spun a story about a mother who didn't want her, a father who had disappeared, and circumstances too painful to revisit. For a child, these explanations were both unsettling and strangely final. How could she argue with something presented as an immutable fact? So the questions would sink back below the surface, replaced by the normal rhythm of school, friendships, and the small joys of youth. But as the years passed, the cracks in the story grew harder to ignore. Each attempt to move forward in life reminded her of the missing pieces. Without a social security number, without an official birth record, she was invisible in a system that required proof of identity for everything. Even so, Nettie built a life for herself. She surrounded herself with a small circle of close friends in Bridgeport, people who saw her as loyal, dependable, and grounded. She was the friend who remembered birthdays, brought soup when someone was sick, and listened without judgment. Her friends knew she had issues with paperwork, but few pressed her for details. What puzzled them most was Anne's reluctance to discuss the past. Even simple questions about Nettie's childhood, where she was born, who her relatives were, could cause Anne to change the subject instantly. It was as if the years before Bridgeport were a locked box, one no one was allowed to open. Nettie learned to live with that silence. She filled in the blanks herself, imagining her birth parents, picturing the lives they might have led. At times, she considered searching for them. At others, she convinced herself it didn't matter, that the life she had was enough. But the curiosity never really left. It was there when she looked in the mirror, wondering where her eyes, her smile, the curve of her jaw came from. It was there when she heard friends tell stories about family traditions she couldn't match. And now, in 2005, with her own child on the way, the questions pressed harder than ever. Soon, she would have to fill out forms for her baby, forms that would ask about her own origins. The truth was, she didn't fully know them. For most of her life, Anne Petway's words had been the foundation of her identity. But that foundation was beginning to crack. The questions she had once let fade into the background were returning, stronger than ever, waiting for the moment when she could no longer ignore them. To understand the questions that haunted Nettie Nance in 2005, you have to go back nearly 2 decades to the sweltering summer of 1987 in New York City. On July 15, 1987, a healthy baby girl was born at Harlem Hospital Center in Upper Manhattan. Her parents, Joy White and Carl Tyson, named her Carlina Renee White. She was their first child, and they were young, filled with the kind of nervous excitement that comes from suddenly becoming a family of 3. The days that followed were a blur of hospital routines. Nurses came in and out, checking vital signs, adjusting monitors, and updating charts. Friends and relatives visited, bringing balloons and flowers, eager to see the tiny new life swaddled in soft blankets. But beneath the joy, there was worry. Carlina had been admitted to the hospital not long after birth with a high fever. Doctors wanted to keep her under observation. For Joy and Carl, the decision was easy. They wanted their baby safe, monitored, and cared for. August 4th, 1987, began like any other day in the pediatric ward. The halls of Harlem Hospital were busy, with nurses in white and pastel uniforms moving between rooms. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mingling with the faint cries of newborns. That morning, a woman dressed in what appeared to be a nurse's uniform entered the room where Carlina lay. She spoke with confidence, telling Joy that she needed to take the baby for a routine checkup. Something about a fever or additional lab work. The woman's demeanor was calm and professional, and she didn't appear out of place in the hospital setting. Joy, still recovering from childbirth and trusting the staff around her, handed over her baby. She could not have known that this moment, a mother placing her child into what she thought were capable hands, would mark the last time she would see Carlina for more than 2 decades. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Joy began to wonder why the nurse hadn't returned. She pressed the call button and asked about her baby's whereabouts. The staff seemed puzzled. No one recalled sending a nurse for that particular test. Panic began to spread. Nurses checked the nursery, the hallways, and the treatment rooms. There was no sign of Carlina. Security was alerted. Announcements were made over the hospital intercom, calling for the return of the missing infant. But there was a problem, a critical one. The hospital's security cameras, which might have shown the woman leaving with the baby, weren't working that day. Whether due to malfunction or neglect, there was no video record of the abduction. Witness accounts were limited. No one had seen a woman walk out with an infant. No alarms were triggered. It was as if Carlina had simply vanished into thin air. Police arrived quickly, questioning hospital staff and visitors. They searched the building from top to bottom, checked stairwells, storage rooms, and even utility closets. Outside, officers scanned the surrounding streets, interviewing anyone who might have noticed a woman carrying a newborn. The only description they had was vague. An African-American woman, possibly in her early to mid-20s, dressed in white, resembling a nurse. No name, no clear physical details, no vehicle spotted. For Joy and Carl, the hours after the disappearance blurred into disbelief and agony. They were ushered into a quiet room while detectives worked, but each time the door opened, it wasn't to bring Carlina back. By evening, the hospital was in lockdown. News of the missing baby spread quickly, drawing media crews to the scene. Cameras flashed in the lobby as reporters tried to get statements. Detectives canvassed nearby neighborhoods, distributed flyers, and checked taxi stands and bus terminals. The assumption was that whoever had taken Carlina could not have gotten far, but by the end of that first night, there was no trace. The case was already unusual. Infant abductions from hospitals were rare, and they almost always left some trail. A sighting, a license plate, a security photo. But in Carlina's case, there was nothing. The absence of working cameras made the investigation exponentially harder. Days turned into weeks. Joy and Carl gave interviews, pleading for their daughter's return. "Just bring her back," Joy told the press, her voice breaking. "Take care of her if you have her, but please bring her home." Police followed leads across the city, even into neighboring states. They checked birth records, adoption agencies, and pediatric clinics for any sign of a baby matching Carlina's description. Every call that seemed promising eventually hit a dead end. By the time summer turned to fall, the trail was cold. No one had seen the woman again. No one had come forward with information that could be verified. It was as if Carlina had been lifted out of her parents' lives and into a hidden existence. For the White family, the loss became a constant presence, a shadow in every photograph, an empty space at every holiday. For law enforcement, the case remained open, but without new evidence, progress was almost impossible. Somewhere, Carlina Renee White was growing up, but not in Harlem, not with Joy White and Carl Tyson, and not under her own name. Within hours of Carlina White's disappearance on August 4th, 1987, the New York City Police Department's Missing Persons Unit was mobilized. Detectives arrived at Harlem Hospital Center, determined to find answers, but from the very beginning, they were fighting against a lack of evidence. The first step was to hear directly from the people most affected: Carlina's parents, Joy White and Carl Tyson. In a small, sterile interview room inside the hospital, detectives took their statements. Joy's voice trembled as she recounted the woman who had walked into the room that morning. She remembered the calm, almost reassuring tone. The woman had spoken with authority, wearing what looked like a nurse's white blouse. She seemed to know exactly what to say to earn a mother's trust. Carl, visibly shaken, added whatever details he could recall from that morning. But like Joy, he had not seen the woman leave with the baby. Neither of them had asked for identification. In a hospital setting, the uniform itself was an unspoken credential. Detectives pressed for physical details. Joy estimated the woman was of medium build, African American, with a smooth, unhurried manner. She wasn't sure of the woman's height, but thought she might be in her 20s. No visible scars, no distinctive jewelry, nothing that could be immediately used to narrow the search. The lack of surveillance footage made matters worse. The hospital's security system, which should have recorded every entrance and exit, was inoperable at the time. Whether it was due to a technical malfunction or human negligence, the result was the same. There would be no video evidence to review. Officers fingerprinted door handles, checked the bassinet Carlina had been in, and searched for any object the suspect might have touched. But in 1987, forensic technology was limited. DNA analysis, still in its infancy, was not yet a routine tool in missing persons cases. Fingerprints collected at the scene were either too smudged to match or belonged to legitimate hospital staff and visitors. Detectives began canvassing the hospital. They interviewed doctors, nurses, orderlies, security personnel, and patients' family members. Some staff vaguely recalled seeing an unfamiliar woman in the ward in the days before the abduction, but no one could say for certain whether it was the same person who took Carlina. Outside the hospital, police officers knocked on doors in the surrounding neighborhood. They visited bus stations, subway platforms, and taxi stands, asking drivers and passengers if they had seen a woman carrying a newborn. Flyers were posted with the baby's photo, her small, round face framed by dark hair, alongside the limited description of the suspect. The investigation quickly spread beyond Manhattan. State police in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut were alerted. Hospitals across the region were asked to watch for anyone arriving with a newborn who didn't appear to have recently given birth. Tips began to pour in. Sightings of women with infants came from all over the city and beyond, but each fizzled out under scrutiny. One woman seen boarding a bus in the Bronx was found to be a new mother traveling home. Another reported sighting in Queens turned out to be a relative carrying a family member's baby. Frustration grew among investigators. The trail was already cooling, and without hard evidence, they were relying on human memory, a fragile and often unreliable resource. Meanwhile, Joy and Carl did everything they could to keep Carlina's face in the public eye. They appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for the safe return of their daughter. Joy's voice would crack on camera, but she pushed through, describing Carlina's features in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize her. Detectives considered all possible angles. Could the abduction have been planned? Was it someone Joy or Carl knew? Or was it the act of a stranger with a desperate desire for a child? The possibility that the abductor had posed as hospital staff raised disturbing questions about security at Harlem Hospital. If she had been in the ward before, unnoticed, it suggested a level of planning. Time spent learning the routines, identifying a moment when a baby could be taken without immediate detection. Police issued a composite sketch based on Joy's recollections. It showed a young African-American woman with a calm expression, dressed in a nurse's blouse. The sketch was distributed to hospitals, clinics, and law enforcement agencies nationwide. But weeks passed without any confirmed matches. As summer turned to fall, the case began to lose momentum. The media moved on to other stories, and while the investigation remained technically active, resources were gradually shifted to more current cases. For Joy and Carl, the bated breath waiting turned into a slow, grinding reality. Birthdays passed without Carlina. Holidays came and went, each one a reminder of the missing place at their table. The file on Carlina White stayed in the NYPD's cold case drawer, a reminder of an investigation that had begun with urgency, but had run aground on the shoals of insufficient evidence. The official record was stark. Infant female, 19 days old, taken from Harlem Hospital Center by an unknown African-American female, medium build, wearing a nurse's blouse. No fingerprints linking to a suspect, no surveillance footage, no confirmed sightings leaving the hospital. The woman who had walked into that room on August 4th had vanished just as completely as the child she carried out. And for the next 23 years, the case would remain in the shadows. Not solved, not forgotten, but stalled. Between 2005 and 2010, the quiet equilibrium of Nettie Nance's life began to fracture. The birth certificate she had discovered in 2005 had already planted seeds of doubt. But it was a conversation with Ann Petway, the woman she had called Mom for nearly 2 decades, that would confirm those doubts in a way that could never be undone. It didn't happen in a single dramatic confrontation. Instead, it emerged in pieces, over a series of conversations that often began with Nettie's persistent questions. She had grown tired of evasive answers. The arrival of her own child only sharpened her need to know the truth. One day, sometime after her baby was born, she pressed again. "Why do the names on my birth certificate not match yours? Why didn't I have this document until now?" Anne's response was quieter than usual. She didn't get angry, didn't brush it off. She simply said something that froze Nettie in place. "I'm not your real mother." The words hung in the air. Nettie's mind scrambled to process them. She asked the obvious next question. Who were her real parents? But Anne offered nothing. No names, no locations, no circumstances. The only detail she gave was a vague statement. Nettie had been given to her as a baby, and she had raised her as her own. Nettie knew immediately that given to her wasn't the whole story. She also understood that Anne wasn't going to tell her more. The conversation ended there, and Anne retreated back into her usual guarded silence. It was the first time Nettie had heard the truth, or at least a sliver of it, spoken aloud. But instead of satisfying her curiosity, it intensified it. If Anne wouldn't talk, she would have to find the answers herself. Around this time, the internet was becoming a more powerful tool for personal searches. Public databases, missing persons websites, and online forums were expanding, giving people access to information that had once been hidden behind institutional doors. Nettie began spending late nights at her computer, often after her child had fallen asleep. She would type in fragments of what she knew: her supposed birth date, the city listed on her birth certificate, the fact that her parents' names were unknown to her. Most of the time, the searches led nowhere. Common names, outdated records, and incomplete data made it nearly impossible to narrow down. But she kept going, driven by a mix of determination and something deeper. A sense that she had been living in a life that wasn't truly hers. It was during these searches that she stumbled upon the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website. She began scanning the cases, focusing on the years close to her own birth. Her logic was simple. If she wasn't Anne's biological child, and she hadn't been adopted legally, there was a chance she was listed somewhere as missing. Night after night, she scrolled through photographs, baby pictures, age-progressed composites, stories of disappearances from decades earlier. Each one carried its own tragedy, but none of them seemed to fit her. At times, the weight of the search felt crushing. She would close the laptop and sit in the dark, wondering whether the truth was even findable. But she couldn't stop. The more Anne refused to answer, the more determined she became to uncover what had been hidden. Anne, for her part, didn't interfere with Nettie's online efforts, but she didn't help either. The silence between them grew heavier, tinged with the unspoken acknowledgement that their relationship had shifted. Nettie's friends noticed the change. She was still the same dependable, warm presence in their lives, but there was a new undercurrent to her conversations, an edge of secrecy, as if part of her mind was always elsewhere. She didn't tell many people what she had learned from Anne. It was too big, too fragile to share with anyone who might dismiss it. By 2010, she had spent 5 years in this limbo, knowing she wasn't who she thought she was, but having no idea who she truly was instead. The internet had become both a lifeline and a labyrinth, offering countless paths but no clear destination. Then, one night, her scrolling paused on a particular listing. The photograph was old, a tiny baby wrapped in a hospital blanket, but something about the eyes stopped her. They looked like hers. The caption read, "Carlina Renee White, abducted from Harlem Hospital Center, New York, August 4th, 1987, at 19 days old." It was the first time she had ever seen the name, and it wouldn't be the last. By the summer of 2010, Nejdra Nettie Nance's late-night searches had become almost ritual. Once her young daughter was asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table with her laptop, the glow of the screen casting her face in pale light. A cup of coffee, sometimes her second or third, sat cooling beside her as she clicked through page after page of missing persons cases. The website of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had become her primary hunting ground. She knew its categories by heart: recent cases, long-term missing, and age-progressed images. She lingered on the latter, staring at the digital composites of children as they might look decades later. On an August night, she decided to focus her search narrowly. Cases from 1987, infants taken from hospitals anywhere in the United States. She scrolled through the thumbnails. tiny, grainy baby photos, until one image made her stop. It was a photograph of a newborn girl wrapped in a standard-issue hospital blanket, her face turned slightly toward the camera. There was something immediately familiar in the shape of the baby's mouth, the way her eyes seemed wide and alert despite her age. Then she saw it. A small, distinct birthmark on the inside of the baby's left arm. It was identical to the one she had carried her entire life. The caption read, "Carlina Renee White. Abducted from Harlem Hospital Center, New York, August 4th, 1987. Age at disappearance, 19 days. Nettie's pulse quickened. The date of the abduction was just weeks after the birth date she'd always been told. The location, New York, matched the city on her birth certificate. And the birthmark. That was no coincidence. She clicked into the case file. The narrative was brief but chilling. Carlina had been taken by an unknown woman posing as a nurse. The hospital's security cameras had not been working. No suspects had ever been confirmed. Her parents, Joy White and Carl Tyson, had been searching for her ever since. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen. A voice inside her was already saying it. "This is you." But the rational part of her mind pushed back. Could it be possible? Could she really have been missing for 23 years without knowing it? The next night, she returned to the page. She compared the baby photo to her own childhood pictures, the few that Ann Petway had kept. The resemblance was undeniable. The decision to act didn't come immediately. For weeks, she sat with the information, unsure of what to do. If she was wrong, she risked opening wounds for a family that had already suffered. If she was right, her entire identity would change. Eventually, the need for the truth outweighed the fear. Nettie found the contact information for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and made the call. Her voice shook as she explained who she was, where she lived, and why she believed she might be the baby in their case file. The representative on the other end listened carefully, then asked her to provide as many personal details as possible: her birth date, the city her birth certificate, and the circumstances in which she had been raised. They also asked about the birthmark. "Yes," Nettie confirmed. "It's on my left arm, just like in the photo." From that moment, the case moved quickly. NCMEC contacted the NYPD and relayed the tip. Detectives from the Missing Persons Unit, who had seen the Carlina White file sit dormant for decades, suddenly had a potential living lead. The first step was to confirm whether Nettie's story could align with the facts of the abduction. Her age matched exactly. Her supposed place of birth, New York, matched. Her lack of legal adoption records raised even more suspicion. Arrangements were made for DNA testing. For Nettie, those days of waiting were some of the longest of her life. She continued to go about her routines, caring for her daughter, working, but her mind was elsewhere, caught between two versions of herself. The person she had been for 23 years, and the person she might have been all along. When the results came back, there was no doubt. The DNA matched Joy White and Carl Tyson. Nettie Nance was Carlina Renee White. It was the twist no one had seen coming. Not the NYPD, not NCMEC, not even Carlina herself until she had stumbled across that photo. The case that had gone cold for over 2 decades had just reignited, and the truth was finally breaking through the surface. When the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children confirmed that Nejdra Nettie Nance's story matched the long cold case of Carlina Renee White, the first priority was to reconnect her with the parents who had lost her 23 years earlier. The process began quietly. NCMEC reached out to Joy White and Carl Tyson, informing them that there was a woman in Bridgeport, Connecticut, who believed she might be their missing daughter. After more than 2 decades of unanswered questions, the news was almost too much to process. Joy later recalled the moment as surreal, the hope she had fought to keep alive suddenly crashing against the fear of being disappointed again. NCMEC didn't arrange an immediate meeting. Instead, they encouraged both sides to exchange basic information to see if the details aligned. On the first call, Carlina, still going by Nettie, at that moment, told Joy and Carl the birth date she had always believed to be hers. It matched the exact date their daughter had been born, July 15th, 1987. She described the small birthmark on her left arm, the same one visible in Carlina's baby photos. She explained that she had been raised without a birth certificate or social security number for much of her life, and that she had been told vague, conflicting stories about her early childhood. For Joy and Carl, every piece of information felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. But it was almost too perfect. And they knew that after so many years, hope alone wasn't enough. The truth had to be proven. The NYPD was brought back into the loop. Detectives from the Missing Persons Unit, who had once walked the halls of Harlem Hospital in 1987 searching for an infant, now found themselves working the case again. Only this time, the possible victim was an adult, calling them directly. The detectives moved quickly to verify what they could. They reviewed the original case file, noting the matching birth date, location, and physical description. They listened to the accounts from Joy and Carl, then compared them to what Carlina remembered. But official confirmation required hard evidence, and in 2010, the gold standard was DNA. Arrangements were made for Carlina, Joy, and Carl to provide samples. For Carlina, the request was daunting. She had already prepared herself for the possibility that she truly was Carlina White. But there was still a chance, however slim, that the test could say otherwise. For Joy and Carl, the days waiting for the results dredged up every painful memory. They remembered the day in August 1987 when their baby had been taken. They remembered every false lead, every tip that had gone nowhere, every long night wondering if she was alive. Now, after all this time, the answer felt just within reach, but still out of their hands. While the testing was underway, there were phone calls. At first, they were cautious, testing the waters. Carlina asked about her infancy, what her parents had been like. Joy described the way she had looked as a newborn, her personality even in those early days. Carl spoke about the pride he had felt when she was born. Those conversations were emotional minefields. There were moments of warmth and connection, and others where the weight of the missing years pressed down hard. Carlina was learning about a family she had been separated from her entire life. Joy and Carl were speaking to a daughter they had missed raising, whose childhood they had lost entirely. When the DNA results finally came back, the answer was clear. A match. Carlina Renee White, missing since she was 19 days old, had been found alive. The confirmation brought relief, but it also set off a chain of emotions and complications. The joy of reunion was tempered by the reality of the circumstances. The woman Carlina had known as her mother for 23 years, Ann Petway, was now a central figure in a criminal investigation, and the family Carlina had just rediscovered lived in a different world from the one she had grown up in. The NYPD moved forward with its investigation, while NGMEC began to guide the reunion process. Media interest was immediate and intense. Word of the case spread quickly, and reporters clamored for details. For Carlina, it was overwhelming. Just months earlier, she had been living an ordinary private life. Now she was the center of a national news story. Her calls with Joy and Carl became longer, more personal. They compared not just memories, but features. Joy pointed out the resemblance in their eyes. Carl noticed the mannerisms they shared. Carlina listened to family stories, trying to bridge the gap of decades with conversation. But beneath the warmth, there was tension. Years of separation could not be erased overnight. Carlina had been raised by someone else in another household, with different values, different traditions. She had been Nettie for most of her life. Now she was Carlina again, a name tied to a past she was only beginning to understand. As the investigation into Petway deepened, Carlina faced the reality that her mother had been the one to take her. Law enforcement wanted her cooperation. The public wanted her story. Her biological family wanted time to make up for what had been lost. The case was no longer cold, but the warmth of the reunion came with heat, the kind that comes when the truth is finally in the open, and everyone involved must decide how to live with it. The case was no longer cold, but as the reunion unfolded, one unanswered question hung in the air. How had Ann Petway pulled off the abduction and kept the secret for 23 years without being caught? The days between the DNA swab and the results felt like an eternity. For Carlina, every hour was a tightrope walk between hope and fear. She knew the test could confirm her deepest suspicion, that she was the missing baby from Harlem Hospital. But it could also prove her wrong, forcing her to live with the weight of having opened an old wound for a grieving family. And then, in the middle of that tense waiting period, the ground shifted again. Ann Petway disappeared. There was no dramatic goodbye, no explanation. One day she was there in Bridgeport, the next, she was simply gone. The woman Carlina had called Mom for 23 years, the person who had been her anchor, even in the midst of confusion, had vanished without a trace. For Carlina, the timing could not have been worse. She was already in emotional freefall, balancing the hope of reunion with the fear of rejection. Now she had to add another layer, the sudden absence of the only parent she had ever known. The media storm was already building. News outlets had caught wind of the possible breakthrough in the long, cold Carlina White case. Reporters began showing up outside Carlina's home, cameras ready, shouting questions. "Are you the missing baby? Have you spoken to your real parents? What do you have to say to Ann Petway?" Carlina had no answers she could give. Not yet. The DNA results were still pending, but the world was already treating her as though the truth had been decided. Her phone rang constantly. Friends, distant relatives, and complete strangers wanted to hear her side of the story. The attention was suffocating. She didn't know what to say, and every word she spoke felt like it might be dissected in the next day's headlines. At night, she lay awake replaying every moment she could remember with Ann. She thought about the birthdays they'd celebrated, the advice Ann had given her, and the way Ann had been there when she had her own child. And yet, she couldn't shake the question, had every single one of those moments been built on a lie? Meanwhile, law enforcement began treating Petway not just as a person of interest, but as a fugitive. They couldn't compel Carlina to testify against her before the DNA results, but Petway's disappearance only deepened suspicion. The FBI became involved, adding federal weight to the search. Carlina tried to shield her daughter from the chaos, but it wasn't easy. Even the grocery store became a gauntlet of stares and whispers. She felt like she was living inside a story that belonged to everyone but her. A headline, a mystery, a case file. For the first time in her life, she felt completely untethered. She had lost her identity once when she was taken as a baby, though she hadn't known it at the time. Now, as an adult, she felt like she was losing it again, this time in full view of the world. The waiting stretched on. Every day without the DNA results felt heavier, more exhausting. She began to wonder if she even wanted the answer. If the test said she wasn't Carlina White, she would have to face the guilt of raising false hope for Joy and Carl. If it said she was Carlina, she would have to face the betrayal of her entire upbringing. For now, all she could do was wait. And in that waiting, she felt the walls closing in. From the media, from the investigation, from the silence of the woman who had raised her, and then walked away. But the moment the truth arrived, it would demand action. And Carlina would be forced to make choices that could never be undone. The phone call came in early 2011. On the other end was a detective from the New York Police Department's Missing Persons Unit, the same unit that had been carrying Carlina White's case since 1987. The results were in. Carlina, known for most of her life as Nejdra Nettie Nance, was, beyond any doubt, the biological daughter of Joy White and Carl Tyson. The DNA match was conclusive. In that moment, the years of searching, wondering, and doubting collapsed into one simple truth. She had been the baby taken from Harlem Hospital when she was just 19 days old. It was a revelation that made headlines for reasons beyond the emotional reunion. For the first time in U.S. history, a long-term missing child had solved her own case. Carlina hadn't been found by investigators or tipped off by a witness. She had found herself, connecting the dots through persistence, memory, and a determination that had outlasted decades. The official confirmation set off a wave of reactions. For Joy and Carl, it was the miracle they had been waiting for. The proof that their daughter was alive and that the connection they felt during those first phone calls had been real. For Carlina, it was both vindication and upheaval. She finally had answers, but those answers forced her to confront the reality of her upbringing. The woman who had loved and raised her was also the woman who had abducted her. In the days after the results, she traveled to New York to meet Joy and Carl in person. The first meeting was a swirl of emotions, laughter, tears, awkward pauses, and moments where they simply stared at one another, trying to absorb the reality. Joy traced her fingers over Carlina's face as if to memorize it, while Carl stood quietly, blinking back tears. But the joy of reunion was complicated. Carlina had deep affection for Ann Petway, despite knowing now what Ann had done. She couldn't simply erase 23 years of shared life. This loyalty put her in a difficult position as the investigation into Petway intensified. Federal agents were closing in. Petway was facing charges of kidnapping, a federal crime with severe penalties. Carlina was urged to cooperate fully with authorities, to give statements, to appear in court if necessary. This was where the reckless decision came in. Rather than immediately aiding the prosecution, Carlina hesitated. She didn't deny what had happened, but she also didn't want to see Petway spend the rest of her life in prison. She was torn between justice for her biological parents and compassion for the only mother she had ever known. Some saw this as a strength, a refusal to be defined solely by victimhood. Others saw it as dangerous, a reluctance that could undermine the case. Meanwhile, the media storm intensified. Interviews were requested daily. Carlina's name and face were everywhere. In newspapers, on television, on internet headlines. She was praised for her determination and courage, but the scrutiny was relentless. Every gesture, every word she said about either family was picked apart. She made another bold choice. She would tell her own story in her own words, rather than let the media shape it for her. She agreed to select interviews, where she spoke about both her joy in finding her biological parents and her complicated feelings toward Petway. In private, she was trying to piece together the life she had before and the life she had now. She began learning about the extended White Tyson family, aunts, uncles, cousins she had never known. She visited neighborhoods from her early days in New York. She asked Joy and Carl about the first 19 days of her life, trying to reclaim memories that had been stolen. It was not an easy process. There were moments of tension with her biological family, misunderstandings rooted in the decades they had spent apart. Carlina had grown up with different habits, different expectations. Joy and Carl had imagined raising her one way. Instead, she had lived another. Still, they kept meeting, kept talking, kept trying. The reunion was not a single moment. It was an ongoing act of rebuilding. In the end, Carlina's persistence had rewritten the ending to one of New York's most haunting cold cases. She had lived for 23 years under a false identity, only to uncover her own truth and hand it back to the very investigators who had been searching for her since 1987. But as the world celebrated the ending of the search, another story was about to unfold. The courtroom reckoning that would decide Ann Petway's fate. It was January 2011, the cold of winter pressing in on New York City, when Carlina White stepped off the train to meet Joy White and Carl Tyson face to face for the first time in 23 years. The station air was sharp and metallic, heavy with the sound of brakes hissing and commuters rushing past. But for Carlina, the world narrowed to a single point. The two people waiting at the end of the platform. Joy's eyes were already brimming with tears. She had imagined this moment for decades, picturing the face of her baby grown into a woman. Now, there she was, tall, poised, a young mother herself, walking toward her with the same eyes Joy had looked into in the hospital that July morning in 1987. Carl stood beside Joy, steady but visibly moved. He had kept hope alive quietly, without fanfare, but now that hope was flesh and blood in front of him. When they embraced, the cameras were rolling. The media had been tipped off to the reunion, and photographers jostled for the perfect shot. Flashbulbs burst like small explosions, capturing every tear, every smile, every awkward laugh that broke through the tension. For Carlina, it was overwhelming. The warmth of her parents' arms felt both instantly familiar and entirely new. There was no guidebook for moments like this, no way to reconcile the joy of reunion with the grief for all the years lost. They sat together for hours, exchanging fragments of stories. Joy told her about the day she was born, the way she had kicked her tiny feet in the hospital bassinet, the pink outfit she had worn home. Carlina spoke about her childhood in Bridgeport, the schools she attended, the friends she had made, the milestones Ann Petway had been there for. Every story was a bridge over a gap that could never be fully closed. Outside their private bubble, the world was watching. News outlets across the country ran the story on their front pages. Missing baby found after 23 years. Solves her own case. Morning shows booked segments. Radio hosts speculated about the investigation. On social media, people debated the emotional complexity. Could someone love both their biological parents and the person who had kidnapped them? In Harlem, the hospital where Carlina had been taken came under renewed scrutiny. Questions about the security failures in 1987 resurfaced. How had the abduction been possible in a crowded ward in the middle of the day? How had the suspect walked out without challenge? For Joy and Carl, the reunion was a victory, but also a reopening of old wounds. Seeing Carlina was proof that she had survived and thrived, but it also brought back the searing memory of the day she was taken. Carlina was pulled in every direction. There were TV appearances, police interviews, and legal consultations. She was asked to recount her story over and over, the moment she found the birth certificate, the search on the NCMEC website, the phone call to the center, the DNA confirmation. But beneath the public celebration was a private reckoning. She now had two families, one by blood, one by upbringing, and they existed in direct conflict. The woman who had raised her, Ann Petway, was now a wanted fugitive. In those January days, the FBI intensified its search for Petway. Tips came in from multiple states. Reporters pressed Carlina for her feelings about Petway's impending arrest. She chose her words carefully, acknowledging the wrong that had been done, but never denying the years of care she had received. Joy and Carl, for their part, made it clear that they wanted justice. They had lost their daughter for more than 2 decades. They had lived with unanswered questions, birthdays missed, milestones unseen. For them, Petway's actions were unforgivable. The collision of these emotions, joy, anger, grief, loyalty, played out in real time, with the public watching every frame. The reunion did not end in that January meeting. In the days that followed, Carlina spent more time with her biological family, meeting relatives she never knew she had. She learned family stories, saw old photographs, and began to piece together the life she might have had. But every celebration was shadowed by the knowledge that the truth was still unfolding. Petway's arrest was coming, and with it, the legal and emotional consequences that would force Carlina to navigate the most difficult choice of her life: how to stand in court between the family she had lost and the woman who had taken her. The truth was finally out, but the next step would test Carlina in a way nothing else had: watching the woman who raised her face justice for the crime that began her story. The hunt for Ann Petway ended on the morning of January 23, 2011. After nearly 2 weeks of being on the FBI's wanted list, her photographs circulated nationwide and her name broadcast on every major network. Petway walked into the FBI's field office in Bridgeport, Connecticut. There was no chase, no dramatic standoff. She simply turned herself in. The moment was quiet compared to the noise that had built up around the case. Federal agents took her into custody, reading her the charges. Federal kidnapping, a crime that carried a possible sentence of decades in prison. For Carlina, the news was another collision of emotions. This was the woman who had fed her, clothed her, and cheered at her milestones. But it was also the woman who had taken her from her real parents and lied for 23 years. Now that the truth had transformed into a criminal case, there was no undoing it. In the weeks that followed, Petway's legal team negotiated with federal prosecutors. The facts of the case were clear. She had walked into Harlem Hospital on August 4, 1987, dressed like a nurse, and convinced the staff that baby Carlina needed medical attention. She then left the hospital and disappeared into the city, raising Carlina as her own in Connecticut and North Carolina. On February 23, 2012, in a federal courtroom, Ann Petway stood before the judge and entered her plea, guilty to the charge of kidnapping. She admitted that she had taken Carlina because she could not have children of her own and feared her boyfriend at the time would leave her. The courtroom was still as Petway spoke. Joy White and Carl Tyson were there, listening to the confession they had waited decades to hear. For them, it was both validation and another reminder of all they had lost. The judge handed down the sentence, 12 years in federal prison. For some, the punishment felt too short for a crime that had stolen an entire childhood. For others, it was a measure of closure, the legal system acknowledging the harm done and imposing consequences. Carlina herself gave no public display of celebration at the sentencing. Her statements to the media were measured, focusing on moving forward and maintaining relationships with both sides of her life. She had made it clear from early on that she did not wish for Petway to die in prison, but she also acknowledged that a crime had been committed and justice had to be served. The story had already cemented its place in U.S. legal and social history. It was unprecedented. A kidnapped child who, as an adult, uncovered her own abduction and set the events in motion that led to the resolution of her case. The media called it a miracle. Law enforcement called it a lesson in the power of persistence. For Joy and Carl, the legal verdict was only one chapter. They still faced the lifelong work of building a relationship with the daughter they had been denied for so long. For Carlina, it was the beginning of a new identity, one that blended her past and present in a way few people could understand. The judge's gavel had fallen, and the law had spoken. But as the prison doors closed behind Ann Petway, one question lingered like an open wound. Could Carlina ever truly belong to one family without losing the other? In the months after the sentencing, life for Carlina White settled into a quieter rhythm, at least on the surface. The cameras faded, the headlines slowed, but the work of living between two worlds had only just begun. Her relationship with her biological parents, Joy White and Carl Tyson, continued to grow, though it was not without its challenges. 23 years apart had left gaps that could not be closed in a matter of weeks or even months. They shared meals, birthdays, and long conversations, piecing together the fragments of a life they might have shared. There were moments of laughter, moments of awkward silence, and moments when the weight of the past pressed too heavily to ignore. Carlina spoke openly to the press about the complexities of her situation. She admitted that reconnecting with her family was a process, one that required patience, forgiveness, and a willingness to accept that their bond would always carry the shadow of what had been lost. She also revealed that she still kept in contact with certain members of the family she had grown up with, cousins, friends, people who had been part of her childhood world in Bridgeport. But her connection to Ann Petway was different. That relationship had ended the day she learned the truth. There were no visits to the prison, no phone calls, no letters. The woman who had once been Mom was now a closed chapter, one Carlina could not bring herself to reopen. In interviews, she expressed no desire for revenge, but also no path to reconciliation. Life moved forward. Carlina focused on raising her own daughter, determined to give her the stability she had been denied. She found strength in telling her story, not to relive the trauma, but to remind others that even the coldest cases can break open when the truth refuses to stay buried. Yet, for all the resolution the courts had delivered, some questions would never be fully answered. How had Petway managed to leave the hospital unseen? Were there people who had known and stayed silent? And perhaps the most personal question of all, one that only Carlina could wrestle with, was whether she would ever truly feel whole, standing with one foot in each of the families that had shaped her life. She expressed no desire for revenge, but also no path to reconciliation. And yet, one question lingers. After everything that happened, should Carlina ever walk through those prison gates, to see the woman who stole her, but also raised her as a mother?